A freezing wind howls across a dark, rocky island in the North Atlantic. For centuries, the people here survived by pulling fish from the cold sea. It was a hard, quiet life built on honest work, but at the dawn of the new century, a strange fever swept through this tight-knit community. The fishermen traded their nets for computer screens. They stopped chasing cod and started chasing numbers. Almost overnight, a tiny nation of 300,000 people decided to conquer the global world of high finance. The rush of easy money felt like magic. Young men who had never managed more than a small-town bank account were suddenly flying in private jets. They bought grand homes in London and expensive art in New York. The country had three main banks. In just a few short years, these three companies grew so fast they seemed unstoppable. They offered high interest rates to anyone who would give them cash. The world eagerly handed over billions. The secret behind this sudden wealth was dangerously simple. The banks were borrowing massive amounts of cheap money from other countries. They took that borrowed money and used it to buy up businesses, stores, and sports teams across Europe. They created a giant web of debt. On paper, everyone looked incredibly rich. But the actual cash did not exist. They were building a giant tower out of playing cards, balancing the weight of the world on a tiny, fragile island. By the time the madness reached its peak, the danger was impossible to hide. The three banks had grown to become 10 times larger than the entire economy of Iceland. Think about that for a moment. If the banks ever needed help, the country did not have the money to save them. The government had let the banks grow into monsters. The watchdogs who were supposed to keep the system safe simply looked away, blinded by the golden glow of the boom. In the fall of 2008, the music stopped. A massive financial crisis swept across the globe. Banks in America and Europe stopped lending money to each other. The flow of cheap cash dried up instantly. The giant Icelandic banks suddenly needed to pay their debts, but their pockets were empty. The playing cards began to fall. In a matter of days, the illusion of endless wealth shattered into a million sharp pieces. The shock hit the streets of the capital city with brutal force. Ordinary families woke up to find their savings accounts frozen. The value of the national money dropped like a stone. Prices in the grocery stores doubled, then tripled. Because the island had to buy most of its food and fuel from other countries, the sudden crash meant people could not afford basic needs. The shelves began to empty. Fear gripped every home. Panic replaced the quiet pride of the island. People who had worked hard all their lives saw their security vanish in a single afternoon. They had trusted the men in the sharp suits. They had believed the promises of endless growth. Now they stared at useless bank statements, wondering how they would feed their children. The deep, biting cold of the coming winter felt darker than ever before. Behind closed doors, the leaders of the country faced a terrifying truth. They looked at the massive debts of the three banks. They looked at the tiny amount of money the government actually held. The math was impossible. The banks owed $13.8 billion just to foreign savers, a sum the nation could never pay. The government realized they could not rescue the banks. The monsters were simply too big to save. The leaders made a choice that shocked the world. They decided to let the banks collapse. Every other rich country was spending billions of taxpayer dollars to save their failing banks. But this tiny island did the exact opposite. They drew a hard line. They promised to protect the money of their own citizens inside the country, but they let the giant international branches die. The wealthy bankers were suddenly left with nothing. This harsh choice triggered a massive international fight. One of the failed banks had run a very popular online savings program called Iceland. Hundreds of thousands of people in Britain and the Netherlands had put their life savings into Iceland because it offered great returns. When the bank died, those foreign savers lost everything. They demanded their money back. But the island nation said they simply did not have the cash to pay them. The anger from abroad was swift and punishing. The British government was so furious that they used anti-terrorism laws against the tiny island. They froze the assets of Icelandic companies in the United Kingdom, treating the small nation like a dangerous enemy. This move crushed the remaining life out of the island's businesses. It was a deep, painful insult to a country that had always been a peaceful friend to the world. The insult from abroad mixed with the burning anger at home. As the dark winter set in, the people took to the streets. They gathered outside the Parliament building. They brought pots, pans, and metal spoons from their kitchens. They beat on the cookware, making a deafening noise that echoed through the cold city. It became known as the Pots and Pans Revolution. The citizens demanded answers from the leaders who had failed them. The noise was the sound of a broken heart. It was the raw, unfiltered rage of a betrayed public. These were not violent criminals. These were teachers, nurses, and fishermen. They stood in the freezing snow, banging their pots until their hands bled. They refused to sit quietly while their futures were stolen. They demanded that someone pay for the greed that had ruined their peaceful home. The deafening noise worked. The government could not withstand the anger of the people. The leaders resigned in disgrace. A new group of leaders stepped in, but the citizens made it clear that new faces were not enough. They did not just want new rules, they wanted justice. They wanted the men who had built the fake towers of money to answer for their crimes in a court of law. The country hired a special team to dig into the ruins of the failed banks. They brought in experts to track the missing money. These financial detectives sifted through millions of emails, secret bank records, and hidden offshore accounts. They were looking for proof of crimes. They wanted to know exactly how the bankers had tricked the world and destroyed the nation. The dark truth they found was worse than anyone imagined. The top bosses of the banks had not just made bad guesses, they had actively lied. They had secretly lent massive amounts of money to themselves and their friends without telling anyone. They used the bank's cash to buy their own stock, making the bank look healthier than it was. It was a giant game of pretend, played with stolen money. The island nation did something almost no other country dared to do after the crash. They started jailing bankers. Police arrested the former bosses, the rich managers, and the men who had flown in private jets. They were dragged into courtrooms, facing the very people they had ruined. The trials were long and complex, but the message was incredibly clear. Seeing these powerful men sent to prison brought a grim sense of peace to the angry streets. In America and Europe, the men who caused the crash kept their bonuses and their mansions. But on this cold island, the kings of finance traded their custom suits for simple prison clothes. It did not bring the lost money back, but it proved that no one was above the law. While the guilty men sat in jail cells, the rest of the country faced a brutal economic recovery. The government had to lock the doors on the nation's money. They created strict rules that stopped anyone from taking cash out of the country. This trapped the remaining wealth inside, stopping the island from bleeding to death. It was an extreme move, but it was the only way to keep the local money alive. The medicine was bitter and caused deep pain. In this country, most home loans were tied to the cost of living. When the prices of food and fuel shot up, the size of every family's debt shot up with it. A person who owed $100,000 suddenly owed $200,000, even though their house was worth less. The system punished the innocent to fix the mistakes of the guilty. The quiet desperation returned. Thousands of families lost their homes because they simply could not pay the doubled debts. They packed their boxes in tears, handing their keys back to the new versions of the very banks that had caused the crash. The national reset was working on paper, but it was built on the broken dreams of regular people who had done nothing wrong. Slowly, painfully, the harsh medicine began to work. Because the local money was now very cheap, the island became a cheap place for foreigners to visit. Tourists began to flood the country, drawn by the beautiful volcanoes, hot springs, and ice caves. The visitors brought fresh cash. The fishing boats went back out to sea. The economy slowly came back to life, built this time on real things instead of fake numbers. The unique recovery of this small nation stood in sharp contrast to the rest of the world. Other countries had chained their taxpayers to the massive debts of failing banks. They saved the rich and punished the poor. But this island had chosen a different, harder path. They let the banks burn. They protected their own people first. They proved that a country does not have to surrender to the giants of finance. Yet, the deep scars of that time remain etched into the heart of the nation. The trust that once tied the small community together was forever broken. You can still see it in the eyes of the older generation. They remember the empty shelves. They remember the sound of the pots and pans. They remember the cold fear of watching their life's work vanish into thin air. The story of Iceland is a stark warning about the blinding power of greed. It shows how quickly the illusion of wealth can destroy a peaceful home, but it also stands as a powerful lesson in courage. When the darkest financial storm of the century hit, a tiny nation of fishermen refused to drown. By investigating the crimes and punishing the guilty, they walked through the fire to build their world again.